Between 1863 and 1890, we had territorial governors. At the time, Idaho was not really a desirable place to be. So there are all sorts of misadventures of these early Idaho territorial governors, some good, some bad, but stories that not a lot of people know about. Idaho became a territory in 1863 with an act signed by President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. And he did that for a number of reasons, actually connected to mining, but also connected to part of his strategy for eventually prevailing in the Civil War. State governors, as everyone knows now, are elected by the people, but territorial governors, they were actually just appointed by the president. As the first territorial governor of Idaho, Abraham Lincoln appointed one of his closest friends, William Wallace. Wallace actually was such a good friend of Lincoln that the president invited Wallace to join him at Ford's Theater on what would become the last 24 hours of his life. Wallace ended up not being able to go to the theater. His wife was ill at the time, but they talked about meeting up soon thereafter, and then William Wallace served as one of President Lincoln's pallbearers later in the week. So Wallace never actually made it out to Idaho. He was followed immediately by a series of 3 or 4 territorial governors who were also not super excited by their appointment and didn't always treat the office of governor with maybe the sort of respect that we would hope from our elected officials. The first one after Wallace was a guy named Caleb Lyon. And Caleb Lyon's legacy here in Idaho was, first of all, signing the act that would move the territorial capital from Lewiston up in the north down to Boise. And that was not an act that was popular with everybody, and he was actually placed on house arrest. He escaped this house arrest by saying that he was going duck hunting with a friend, because I guess that was an excuse that worked apparently. But instead of going duck hunting, or perhaps in addition to going duck hunting, he hightailed it out of town, went to Walla Walla, and got away. Lyon was then followed up by a governor named Clinton DeWitt Smith. And Smith wasn't much better. He was known for being jovial and hard drinking, and he actually followed up on Lyon's plan to move the capital from Lewiston to Boise by literally stealing the state seal and other important documents that belonged in the capital and bringing them down to Boise. And this was done for mining interests in which he may have felt like he would get a cut. And so again, it wasn't popular with everybody. A lot of the state's population was up in the north, and obviously northern Idahoans wanted to keep the capital. There were a lot of northern Idahoans at the time who really just wanted to be part of Washington. Part of keeping northern Idaho as part of Idaho itself was keeping the capital up there. So you can imagine how hard it was and how divided the state was at the time. Clinton DeWitt Smith stole the state seal and as much of the archives as he could and brought him to Boise, and then promptly died. Smith was followed up by a guy named Horace Gilson. Gilson became notable mostly for embezzling more than $40,000 and hightailed it to Hong Kong to get away. And then, fun fact, Caleb Lyon came back and was the next acting governor yet again for the territory of Idaho. He pushed for Idaho to become a state, probably so he could become a senator, because in the territories, you really wanted to be a senator or a member of the House of Representatives, because then you could actually hang out in DC instead, where it was nice, instead of being in this sort of dusty, lawless place. Lyon became the governor, and he was extremely unpopular, as you might expect, and he ended up also stealing more than $46,000 from the territory of Idaho, and he got himself out of town as well. We eventually ended up having a couple of better governors, including one named Edward Stevenson, who in the 1880s was governor and was incredibly important in keeping the state of Idaho intact as the shape and as the state that we know it today. There were different interests in different parts of the state at the time. There was a huge movement in northern Idaho to separate and join Washington instead. And so Stevenson worked on a couple of different ways to keep them happy, including putting the University of Idaho up in Moscow. But then there was actually a bill that went through Congress and was signed to divide up Idaho. Edward Stevenson was also cousins of Adlai Stevenson, who was the Vice President of the United States under Grover Cleveland. And Edward Stevenson worked with his cousin, the Vice President, to convince President Cleveland to pocket veto that bill, basically. So to just plain not address it, essentially, to never sign the bill and therefore veto it, keeping the state of Idaho the shape that it is now. And in fact, there was yet another movement that was not quite as far along as the secession movement in northern Idaho, but it was another movement that was gathering steam in Congress to essentially add all of southern Idaho onto Nevada, which was starting to lose some of its early mining boom money that it had. And so we almost ended up in a situation with Idaho not existing at all, with all of us just being part of Washington or part of Nevada. And that didn't quite happen. And so Idaho remains.